All right, so welcome to episode 3 of the episode 81 podcast. And this is the third of our 3-part series that was taken from a longer sort of brain dump interview I did. Again, I'm using Claude Code to interview me because I knew that I didn't really have the chops right now to sustain a podcast by myself, right? To just sit there and talk into the camera like this. And so I created a project in Claude that acted as a podcast host, an interviewer, to ask me those questions. In this episode, each of the 3 episodes in this series was taken from that, and they were assembled thematically, right? Everything that fit within a specific theme or idea was put together into an episode. Because that's how YouTube is serving up its content now, right? So rather than just chop it up chronologically, part 1, part 2, part 3, we had the episode 1, which was more about the idea of how to preserve your voice in your content, right? How to find your true voice and preserve that in your content. The second part talks about the specifics of creating content that speaks directly to your audience in a way that sets you up as the ideal person for the next role you want to step into in your career trajectory. And so now this third episode is a little bit more about what I'm doing here, where I'm demonstrating this is how the system works, and it's built on the fact that I've been using this system for years to create my own content. So we get into some real nuts and bolts about how if you wanted to do this all yourself and create all this content yourself, you're perfectly welcome to do that, right? I tell you exactly pretty much the instructions I give to build the podcast host that I built in Claude, so you could do that. And then it's just a matter of taking that, converting that into a master content document about that specific content, and then using that master content document then to pull all of the micro content that you post on LinkedIn or wherever else you want to build out your repository. And so if you wanted to do that yourself, you're more than welcome to take this and run with it and do it yourself, right? That's no skin off my back. So without further ado, we'll get into the episode. No, it's 100% intentional. And that's the reason I'm doing this as the podcast itself, right? Because we're having this conversation, we're digging into the nuances, you're helping me provide extra value for the audience, right? And what we're doing, we're already 40 minutes into this conversation, and we're getting some really good stuff. Now comes the process of taking this conversation and turning it into those individual pieces of content that will actually build the repository, right? The things that speak to the different aspects of the 5 problems that I solve for these executives. And so that's a whole nother layer, right? I'm going to have to take this transcript and I'm going to have to convert that into a master content document around this particular topic. Right? And then comes the process of doing that in a way that preserves 90 to 95% my voice, my ideas, my words in my own voice, so that then we can take that and build that content into smaller bite-sized pieces of content to go on LinkedIn and onto my blog or the episode 81 website in a way that starts building out that repository. Right? And even though this is super simple as a way to get that content out of my head, and to make sure it is aimed directly at the audience and the problems that they're facing, the process of actually then turning that into the content is still pretty involved. And as you mentioned, for the executives who don't have a lot of extra time, if all I had to do, and we're at 41 minutes now because we had a little bit of the technical difficulties around working with the voice mode in Claude, which didn't work out great. But if all I had to do was invest in this 30-minute conversation, and then that's it for 2 weeks, right? And then someone else took this pulled together that master content document, formulated that out into a couple dozen bite-sized pieces of content that go out over the next 2 weeks, all replicating my voice, speaking about my ideas directly aimed at the problems that my next ideal hiring managers or my customers are facing. And so it's going to help me speak directly to them about the things that matter to them, right? We're talking to them about them, not at them about me. And if all I had to do was spend this 30 minutes twice a week, then yeah, that's an investment that's well worth it, right? And I can recognize that. And if they recognize that as well, then maybe they'll be interested. Yeah, so there have been a couple of iterations, and I play with lots of different AI apps. And so started out as a custom GPT, and then I turned it into a gem in Gemini. And currently, I'm actually using a product inside Claude. Yeah, and so basically, I gave it a set of instructions. It says, you are the interview architect. Your sole job is to interview the user, the founder or expert, and surface rich, authentic, raw material that can later be sculpted into content of any format, right? And has guiding principles, right? Warm professionalism. You should sound like a curious, respectful peer, never a stern interrogator. Ask one question at a time. Wait for the user's answer before you respond with the next question. We're looking for depth over breadth. Keep digging on a subtopic until you've captured stories, emotions, and facts and memorable phrases. The user's voice matters. No jargon and cliches. I'm giving you the highlights on some of this. Stay adaptable. If the user veers off topic, follow the energy and then guide the conversation back on track, which you've done several times here. Summarize to confirm, right? After finishing each subtopic, give one sentence recap and ask, did I miss anything important before you move on? And you're clearly doing that as we go through this. Talks about how the first exchange, you're supposed to ask me what I want to talk about and what the goals are for this conversation, and then deliver a roadmap, which you did. You actually did that before we actually started recording. But yeah, I think we did get the actual roadmap on tape, as it were. Yeah, and then a couple of stylistic reminders for questions. Start with verbs, describe or walk me through, or what surprised you about. Use general follow-ups. Could you give an example? How did that make them feel? Celebrate small revelations. That's a powerful insight. Thank you for sharing. I think you might do that a little bit too much. It's not bad. And then keep sentences short and readable. And that's roughly the system instructions. And yeah, and then I've also given it a couple of documents to use for context in the files to serve as its knowledge base, where it gives sort of detailed descriptions about some of the different things that I want to be interviewed about in different contexts, right? So it understands what we're doing here as we're talking through this stuff for episode 81, right? And so it understands the audience and what we're going for. And yeah, and I dropped a bunch of context into it in the beginning of this about this specific interview and what we were going for here. So yeah, it's evolved over time, but basically it's just setting up a custom, in this case, project. You can use a ChatGPT, a custom GPT. You can use a gem inside Gemini. And its sole purpose is to act as a proxy or an advocate for the audience. And its main goal is to extract as much value as possible on behalf of that audience.
So you essentially wrote a job description for an interviewer that doesn't exist yet, and then hired an AI to fill the role. And the proof that it works is the conversation we're having right now. Here's what I find fascinating about that. You said it acts as a proxy or an advocate for the audience. That's a very specific framing. It's not just asking questions. It's asking questions on behalf of someone. That changes the whole orientation of the conversation. How does it feel different psychologically to answer questions when you know the questions are being asked on behalf of a specific audience versus just talking to a machine?
That is the whole crux of the episode 81 philosophy. I could sit here and talk about what I think about all this stuff all day long. That doesn't mean anybody wants to hear it, right? But when I had the interviewer who's keeping me honest and on track based solely on those problems that I know I can solve for this specific audience. And it is going to ask questions from a frame of reference that is designed specifically to help that audience solve those problems. So it's not just asking me, what do I think about the state of this, right? Or what's my philosophy on this topic? As you notice about how this is asking questions, it's constantly going back to when you think about that executive who is trying to build a brand or who doesn't realize they have a problem or who doesn't feel like they have the time, it's constantly refocusing my answers on those problems for those specific people. And so when I answer, I am answering with those particular people in mind, right? So I'm speaking to them through you as the interviewer. I'm not just it's not the same as just brainstorming with Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, right? This is specifically using you to help me direct this conversation directly at the audience I'm talking to.
So the interviewer isn't just a question generating machine. It's an audience alignment mechanism. Every question is a redirect back to the people you're serving. And that changes not just what you say, but who you're saying it to in your head when you answer. That's the difference between journaling and broadcasting. Same person, same ideas, completely different orientation. Let me ask you the uncomfortable version of this question. When you're interviewing yourself, even with a well-designed system, what's the hardest part? Where does it still break down or fall short compared to having a real human on the other side of the table?
So in the end, AI is always going to be a regression to the mean engine. And so it is going to take, even as rich as the context I give it, it's going to ask questions that it comes up with based on those sorts of things. And so what's not going to happen is that if I were talking with a human being who's an executive on that other side, and something I say triggers and connects with something that is adjacent to this whole conversation, right? It's going to spark an idea for a whole other problem or a whole other rabbit trail to go down. That's very unlikely to happen in this context. It's going to stick to the script. It's going to, which is good. It's going to keep me on script based on the things I want to talk about. But it's not quite the same as having an onboarding session with a living client who is going to take all of this stuff that I know works, but then they're also going to bring something from completely out of left field and ask questions about that. And it could very well be something that this actually applies to. That sort of stuff is not going to be surfaced in these conversations.
So the AI interviewer is excellent at depth within the known territory, but it can't stumble into the unknown territory the way a human can. A real executive sitting across from you might say something that cracks open a whole new problem you didn't even know you solved. That's actually a compelling argument for why episode 81 isn't just a content service. The onboarding conversation with a real client does something the self-interview system can't. It expands the map. One more question on this subtopic. You've been through multiple iterations of this. Custom GPT, Gemini Gem, now Claude. What changed between versions? What did you learn about what makes a good AI interviewer that you couldn't have known until you'd actually used one?
Okay, so the journey actually starts before we'd even had this interview, right? I mentioned the onboarding process where first we get crystal clear about creating the persona of your audience, right? The ICP, right? The ideal customer persona behind your ideal hiring manager, whoever it is that gatekeeps the next position you want to have, and possibly even your current customers, if that's something that you're interested in, right? Be crystal clear about who they are and what are the 3 to 5 core problems you solve for that person. Then we dive into what I call the hearts and minds method, where we get at the emotional and informational needs they have attached to those problems, right? What are they afraid of? What are they concerned about? What do they feel their limitations are? Those sorts of things, so that we can really start to generate content that speaks to those problems. Because I'm a firm believer, based on my years of experience, that people don't make rational decisions. They make emotional decisions and rationalize them, right? So you can't make anyone do something they don't already want to do. And if someone really wants to do something, there's no force on earth that can stop them. And so my goal as a copywriter is not to make someone do something. It's simply to make them want to do it, right? And so to do that, all we have to do, if I can make them want to do it, then all I have to do is give them the information they need to convince themselves that's the right course of action to take. So that's persuasion in a nutshell. And so understanding the emotional needs and informational needs they have around those problems is critical to developing then the content strategy. And then that content strategy acts as a roadmap for our future conversations. And then the conversation happens, like something like this. And at the end of this, I'll take the entire transcript of this and I'll go through it, and we'll create a master content document that preserves your thoughts in your words as much as possible, right? All we're doing is providing structure and a little bit of clarification here and there where it's needed. But by and large, it's all your words. And then we can draw from that and say, all right, from this, what are the core elements that could serve as the impetus for a series of long-form blog posts, perhaps, or even LinkedIn articles, right? And then from those articles, how do we chop that up into bite-sized pieces to serve as posts on LinkedIn? And again, we're still taking that same content, we're still keeping your words and your ideas. Again, we're just shaping it for structure and consumability. And so even if we're changing up stuff in the master content document to create the specific content, you're still looking at 85 to 95% your voice. And then we put that together for a week or a 2-week period. And then we give that to you for you to approve or suggest changes. And then you're done. Your entire investment is the 30-minute interview every 2 weeks. And then maybe 10 or 15 minutes to approve the content that goes out. And then once you do that, you're done. And then we do everything else. And then we can even post it on your behalf on your LinkedIn account if you would like to give us the authority to do that. And then, and then we will go through and we will keep track of the analytics and what's going on. And the point of this is not for any one post to go viral, right? We're focusing on building the repository post by post over time. But the engagement will give us some signals as to which topics we're talking about and how we're talking about them, and whether or not they are moving people in the audience, right? And then the people who do engage with it, are they the people we're actually aiming at? And that will help us shape the next round of conversations and content as we move forward, so that we're posting and iterating and posting and iterating and posting and iterating in a way that creates the repository that's going to position you as the ideal solution to that specific person's problem.
So the whole system is a loop. The content informs the strategy shapes the next conversation, the conversation generates the next content. It compounds over time, and the executive's total time investment is 30 minutes of conversation plus 15 minutes of approval. Everything else is handled. That's the offer distilled to its simplest form. But let me push on one thing you said. You're not chasing virality, you're building a repository.
All right, so that was episode 3 of episode 81 with Danny Thompson. And as you can see, this really did give you the whole sort of framework for how to use this process to create content that's aimed at your audience in the way that's going to resonate with them, and how to create it in a way that's going to preserve your voice. In future episodes, we will get into specific frameworks for how to create engaging content and dig deeper into how to ensure that you are speaking to the emotional needs and informational needs around your audiences, the problems that you can solve for them to set you up as the right person for that next role in your career trajectory. Now, I know that you may be looking at this and these episodes seem unpolished, and they are, because I've never run a podcast before. But that's okay. The important thing is getting the ideas out. Part of the process of building it, and why it's called episode 81 to begin with, is that is the mindset I want people to have going into this. If you're creating executive branding content, you want to start talking now about these things. And as you go deeper, and not everyone will do a podcast like this, right? I will admit that this is uncomfortable to get started at first if you're not used to it. And I'm lucky enough that I've been on camera for things before, so that part doesn't bother me. But this is a new format for me, where I'm recording alone in my office to an audience of people on the other side of the screen like this. I get that, and it's not going to be for everybody. But I still like the idea of recording your voice to get those initial ideas out, because that's where your voice comes from. There's a reason why we call it your unique voice when you create content. And actually using your physical voice is the fastest, easiest way to get that out and capture it so that you can develop it further, right? And so if nothing else, even if you don't use this to create your own podcast like this, or your own videos, if you're not into video content, that's fine. In my mind, this is still the fastest, easiest way to get those ideas out there in your own voice, so that you can then spin that out into written content if you want, or whatever other formats you want. Now, in case you're wondering about what's going on behind me here, this is my office, and aside from what I do professionally, one of my favorite pastimes is hiking, backpacking, camping. And so on this side over here, we have all my sleeping bags. Over here, we've got several backpacks. There's a whole rack over here that has camping gear on it. Yeah, it's just, the space is authentically mine. Make of that what you will. And yeah, so in future episodes, we'll dig deep into some of those frameworks on how you take that, first on how you develop the content around the specific emotional and informational needs that your audience has, because it is a slightly different way of thinking about creating content than perhaps you've been doing in the past. And also specific frameworks for taking that master content document that you create from each conversation that you have, and then turn that into the specific pieces of content, whether that's a LinkedIn post or a LinkedIn article, or you're doing an email series, maybe you have a Substack, or if you wanted to do short form video on YouTube or on Reels or as TikTok, right? So I'll have ways to help you do that quickly and efficiently. But yeah, so I hope you'll join me, and yeah, we'll build this together as we go.